So let's begin with the economy. We're in a point where the economy is growing.
Right.
We have very high corporate profits. We have a record stock market.
Right.
And yet, for decades now, we've not been seeing significant wage increases for the
Right.
American people. How have we gotten to a point where we can have high corporate profits when businesses can be doing so well,
Right.
but the workers don't necessarily share in that prosperity?
Well, this has been at least a 3-decade-long trend, and this was a major topic in my State of the Union address. We obviously came in at a time of enormous crisis, and the first task was making sure that we didn't have a complete global economic meltdown. The steps that we took, whether making sure the financial system was functioning, saving the auto industry, encouraging state and local spending, all those things made a difference in buoying the economy. Then it's been a hard but steady slog to the point where now we're growing at a robust pace. Unemployment has come down faster than any time in the last 30 years. In some ways, we're now back to the position where we can focus on what is this longer-term trend, and that is a larger and larger share of wealth and income going to the very top, and the middle class, or folks trying to get into the middle class, feeling increasingly squeezed because their wages have stagnated. Now, there are a whole bunch of reasons for that. Some of it has to do with technology and entire job sectors being eliminated, travel agents, bank tellers, a lot of middle management because of efficiencies with the internet and a paperless office. A lot of it has to do with globalization and the rest of the world catching up. Post-World War II, we had just some enormous structural advantages because our competitors had been devastated by war, and we had also made investments that put us ahead of the curve, whether in education or infrastructure or research and development. Around the 70s and 80s, and then accelerating beyond that, those advantages went away at the same time as because technologies, companies are getting a lot more efficient. And one last component of this is that workers increasingly had less leverage because of changes in labor laws and the ability of capital to move and labor not to move. You combine all that stuff, and it's put workers in a tougher position. So our job now is to create additional tools that, number one, make sure that everybody's got a baseline of support to be able to succeed in a constantly moving economy, whether it's healthcare that survives job loss, whether it is making sure that we have childcare that allows a working household family to prosper while still caring for their kids, having a certain baseline in terms of wages through the minimum wage. So that's one set of issues. A second set of issues then becomes, how do we make sure that everybody has the tools to succeed in a economy where they're going to constantly have to adapt, and how do they move up the value chain, essentially, because they can work in higher wage, higher skill professions, and we're able to compete for those jobs internationally. Then the third thing is making sure that we've got an economy that's productive. Now, if we do all those things, then what I'm confident about is that we can continue to lower the unemployment rate, increase the participation rate, and continue to grow and increase productivity. We're still going to have a broader, longer-term global question, and that is, how do we make sure that the folks at the very top are doing enough of their fair share? The winner-take-all aspect of this modern economy means that you've got some people who just control enormous amounts of wealth, and we don't resent their success. On the other end, just as a practical matter, if we're going to pay for schools, roads, et cetera, and you've got 50 people or 80 people having as much wealth as 3 billion, you're going to have problems making sure that we're investing enough in the common good to be able to move forward. So that's a long-term question, but right now there's some very specific things we can do that makes a difference and can help middle-class families, and that's why I called it middle-class economics.
To focus a bit on that long-term question, does this put us in a place long-term where redistribution becomes, in a sense, a positive good in and of itself, that you have an economy, or potentially you have the government playing the role not of powering the growth engine, which is a lot of what had to be done after
Right.
the financial crisis, but of making sure that while that growth engine is running, it is ensuring that enough of the gains and prosperity is shared, that the political support for that fundamental economic model remains strong.
Well, yeah, that's always been the case, though. I don't think that's entirely new. I mean, the fact of the matter is that relative to our post-war history, taxes now are not particularly high or particularly progressive compared to what they were, say, in the late 50s or the 60s. You know, there's always been this notion that for a country to thrive, there are some things, as Lincoln said, that we do better together than we can do for ourselves. Whether that's building roads or setting up effective power grids or making sure that we've got high-quality public education and the teachers are paid enough, the market will not cover those things, and we've got to do them together. Basic research falls in that category. So that's always been true. I think that part of what's changed is that a lot of that burden for making sure that the pie was broadly shared took place before government even got involved. If you have stronger unions, then you had higher wages. If you had a corporate culture that felt a sense of place and commitment, so that the CEO, was in Pittsburgh or was in Detroit and felt obliged, partly because of social pressure, but partly because they felt a real affinity for the community, to reinvest in that community and to be seen as a good corporate citizen. Today, what you have is quarterly earning reports. You have compensation levels for CEOs that are tied directly to those quarterly earnings. You've got international capital that is demanding maximizing short-term profits. And so what happens is that a lot of the distributional questions that used to be handled in the marketplace through decent wages or healthcare or defined benefit pension plans, those things all are eliminated, and the average employee, the average worker, doesn't feel any benefit. Part of our job is what can government do directly through tax policy. What we've proposed, for example, in terms of how we treat capital gains, that would make a big difference in our capacity then to give a tax break to a working mom for childcare. That's smart policy, and there's no evidence that that would hurt the incentives of folks at Google or Microsoft or Uber not to invent what they invent or provide the services they provide. It just means that instead of $20 billion, maybe they've got 18, right? But it does mean that that mom can go to work without worrying that her kid's not in a safe place. But we also still have to focus on the front end, which is, even before taxes are paid, are there ways that we can increase the bargaining power and making sure that an employee has some measurable increases in their incomes and their wealth and their security as a consequence of an economy that's improving. And that's where issues like labor laws make a difference. That's where say in shareholder meetings and trying to change the culture in terms of compensation at the corporate level, those things could make a difference. And there's been some interesting conversations globally around issues like inclusive capitalism and how we can make it work for everybody.
When you drill into that pre-tax portion, one thing you often find in wages is healthcare costs.
Yeah.
And when you drill deeper into the healthcare costs, one thing you find is that a major piece of why Americans pay so much more is that when we go to a hospital, an MRI or an appendectomy or even a bottle of cholesterol drugs just costs much more for an American to buy than it does in Germany, in Japan, in Canada, in Great Britain. Why do you think Americans pay so much higher healthcare prices than folks in other countries?
Well, there are a lot of theories about this, but I think the evidence points to a couple of key factors. One is we got a third-party system. Mostly we've got a system where everybody gets their health insurance through their employers. Obviously, the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, helps to cover the gap for those who aren't in that system. But for those of us who have an insurer, we don't track it. and the market then becomes really opaque and really hard to penetrate. And health providers are able to, I think, charge without much fear that somebody's looking over their shoulders and asking, well, why is this cost that much? So that's part of it. That's one of the reasons why the Affordable Care Act, a lot of the attention's been on making sure that the uninsured have peace of mind, and that people who currently have insurance but at some point might lose it or have pre-existing conditions are going to have it. That's obviously the moral basis for what we did. But people haven't been paying as much attention to a lot of the delivery system reforms that we're trying to institute through the Affordable Care Act as well. I can't take credit for all 4 years of the lowest healthcare inflation in the last 50 that we've seen since the Affordable Care Act passed. Some of the trends, I think, were already on their way. But we are accelerating a lot of reforms. For example, what do we do to make sure that instead of paying a doctor or a hospital for just providing a service, let's make sure that they're being rewarded for a good outcome, which may mean in some cases fewer tests or a less expensive generic drug, or just making sure all your employees wash their hands so that you're cutting the infection rate, or making sure that hospitals are reimbursed when there's a lower readmissions rate as opposed to when they're doing more stuff. And using Medicare as a lever, I think, is creating an environment in the healthcare field where we can start getting better outcomes and lower costs at the same time. Now there's still going to be those who argue that unless you got a single payer system, you're never going to get all the efficiencies. There's certain areas like drugs where the fact that Congress has not, and the Republican Party in particular, has been resistant to letting drug makers and Medicare negotiate for the lowest price, results in us paying a lot more than we should. But if we're paying 4, 5, 6, 8% more than other countries for the same outcomes, I'd be pretty happy if we just get to the point where we're only paying 2 or 3% more, because that represents hundreds of billions of dollars and means that we can do a lot with that money.
When you talk about Medicare as a lever, Medicare tends to pay a lot less per service than private insurers by a margin.
Right.
Before single payer, there's also this idea you hear occasionally of letting private insurers band together with Medicare, with Medicaid, to jointly negotiate prices. Do you think that's a good idea?
I think that moving in the direction where consumers and others can have more power in the marketplace, particularly when it comes to drugs, makes a lot of sense. Now, you'll hear from the drug companies that part of the reason other countries pay less for drugs is they don't innovate. We essentially, through our system, subsidize the innovation, and other countries are free riders. And there's probably a little bit of truth to that, but when you look at the number of breakthrough drugs and the amount of money that drug companies now are putting into research and where they're putting it, a whole lot of it is actually in redesigning modestly existing drugs so that they can renew patents and maintain higher prices and higher profits. That's not entirely true, but there's some of that. So there is a lot of savings that could be achieved while still making sure that our drug industry is the best in the world, and we'll still be making a healthy profit.
To turn a bit towards politics, at this point, according to polls, you are the most polarizing president really since we began polling. But before you, the record was set by George W. Bush. Before George W. Bush, the record was set by Bill Clinton. It seems that there is something structural happening there in terms of party polarization and the way it affects approval ratings and cooperation with presidents. In your State of the Union, you struck back at critics who say that the idea of healing some of these divisions is naive or impossible. So when you welcome your successor into office, what would you tell them there is worth trying that you think can still work that would reduce the polarization?
Well, there are a couple of things that, in my mind at least, contribute to our politics being more polarized than people actually are. And I think most people just sense this in their daily lives. Everybody's got a family member or a really good friend from high school who is on the complete opposite side of the political spectrum. And yet we still love them, right? And everybody goes to a soccer game and watching their kids and coaching, and they see parents who they think are wonderful people, and then if they made a comment about politics, suddenly you'd go, I can't believe you think that. But a lot of it has to do with the fact that, A, the balkanization of the media means that we just don't have a common place where we get common facts and a common worldview the way we did 20, 30 years ago. And that just keeps on accelerating. I'm not the first to observe this, but you've got the Fox News, Rush Limbaugh folks, and then you got the MSNBC folks, and I don't know where Fox falls into that, but you guys are, I guess, for the brainiac nerd types. But the point is that technology, which brings the world to us, also allows us to narrow our point of view. That's contributed to it. Gerrymandering contributes to it. There's no incentive for most members of Congress, on the House side at least, in congressional districts, to even bother trying to appeal. And a lot of it has to do with just unlimited money. So people are absorbing an entirely different reality when it comes to politics, even though the way they're living their lives and interacting with each other isn't that polarized. So my advice to a future president is to increasingly try to bypass the traditional venues that create divisions and try to find new venues within this new media that are quirkier, less predictable. Yesterday I did 3 interviews with YouTube stars that generally don't spend a lot of time talking about politics. And the reason we did it is because they're reaching viewers who don't want to be put in some particular camp. On the other hand, when you talk to them very specifically about college costs or about health care or about any of the other things that touch on their individual lives, it turns out that you can probably build a pretty good consensus. Now that doesn't ignore the fact that, I would love to see, some constitutional process that would allow us to actually regulate campaign spending the way we used to, and maybe even improve it. I'd love to see changes at the state level that reduced political gerrymandering. So there are all kinds of structural things I'd like to see that I think would improve this. But there have been periods in the past where we've been pretty polarized. I think there just wasn't polling around. As I recall, there was a whole civil war. That was pretty a good example of polarization that took place here.
Do you think that if we don't get some of those structural reforms, and more to the point, if we sort of continue along this path in terms of where the parties are in Congress, are there ways to govern with polarization? It occurs to me that your argument when you came to office, but before you, Bush, who is a uniter, not a divider, before him, Clinton, who was going to moderate and change the Democratic Party with his sort of third way approach. The last couple of presidents have come to office promising the way they would get things done is to reduce polarization. Is there an argument or an approach that can be made to govern amidst polarization?
A couple observations. Number one is that in American history, even during the so-called golden age where you had liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats and there was deal cutting going on in Congress, generally speaking, big stuff didn't get done unless there was a major crisis or you had big majorities of one party controlling the Congress and a president of the same party. I mean, that's just been the history. There have been exceptions, but that's often been the case in terms of big muscle movements in the political system. My first 2 years in office, when I had a Democratic majority and a Democratic House and Democratic Senate, we were as productive as any time since Lyndon Johnson. And when the majority went away, stuff got blocked. Probably the one thing that we could change without a constitutional amendment that would make a difference here would be the elimination of the routine use of the filibuster in the Senate. I think that does, in an era in which the parties are more polarized, almost ensure greater gridlock and less clarity in terms of the positions of the parties. And there's nothing in the Constitution that requires it. The framers were pretty good about designing a House, a Senate, 2 years versus 6-year terms, every state getting 2 senators. There were a whole bunch of things in there to assure that a majority didn't just run rampant. The filibuster in this modern age probably just torques it too far in the direction of a majority party not being able to govern effectively and move forward its platform. And I think that's an area where we could make some improvement.
One of the powerful things that's happened as polarization has increased politically is it's begun structuring people's other identities. And the one I'm particularly interested in here is race. If you look back at polling around the O.J. Simpson verdict or the Bernhard Goetz shooting in New York, Republicans and Democrats, you basically couldn't tell them apart. Now you look at the Zimmerman verdict or you look at what's going on in Ferguson, and opinion on racial issues is very sharply split by party. Do you worry about the merging of sort of racial and partisan identity?
I don't worry about that because I don't think that's going to last. I worry very much about the immediate consequences of mistrust between police and minority communities. I think there are things we can do to train our police force and make sure that everybody's being treated fairly. And the task force that I assigned after the Ferguson and New York cases is intended to produce very specific tools for us to deal with it. But over the long term, I'm pretty optimistic, and the reason is because this country just becomes more and more of a hodgepodge of folks. And again, this is an example of where things seem very polarized at the national level and media spotlight, but you go into communities. One of the great things about being president is you travel through the entire country, and you go to Tennessee, and it turns out like you've got this huge Kurdish community, and you go to some little town in Iowa, and you see some Hasidic Jewish community, and then you see a bunch of interracial, black and white couples running around with their kids, and this is in these little, farm communities, and you've got, Latinos in the classroom when you visit the schools there. So people, I think, are getting more and more comfortable with the diversity of this country, much more sophisticated about both the cultural differences, but more importantly, the basic commonality that we have. And the key is to make sure that our politics and our politicians are tapping into that better set of impulses rather than our baser fears. My gut tells me, and I've seen obviously in my own career, but you see it generally, that a politician who plays on those fears in America, I don't think is going to, over time, get a lot of traction. It's not a perfect analogy, but if you think about how rapidly the whole issue of the LGBT community and discrimination against gays and lesbians has shifted. I mean, the Republican Party, even the most conservative, they have much less ability, I think, to express discriminatory views than they did even 10 years ago. And that's a source of optimism. It makes me hopeful.
On Obamacare, something that members of your administration have always said, I think that you may have said, is there's been a lot of language about it being a good start, a platform to begin building. It's full of experiments. The idea is that there will be learning and there will be change. It's been going now, we're in the second year of open enrollment. What would you like to see if Congress were able to take up a bill to tweak, to improve, to change, to build on that platform? What specifically, from either what you wanted in there originally or what we've learned since it's actually been in operation, how would you like to see it improved?
Well, you know, I'm not sure, Ezra, that we've got enough years of it being in place to know perfectly what needs to be improved, where there's still gaps. You know, it's been a year. So far, the verdict is that this thing's working for a lot of people. You've got 10 million people who've been enrolled. You got more folks who've been signed up for the expanded Medicaid coverage. You've seen healthcare inflation stay low, or actually be significantly lower than before the ACA was passed. Satisfaction with the insurance seems to be high. We haven't seen major disruptions in the medical system that a lot of people had predicted. There's a lot of stuff that's working. Over time, I think seeing if we can do more on delivery system reform, making sure that we fill the gaps in those states that haven't expanded Medicaid. I mean, the big problem we have right now with Obamacare is that it was designed to make sure that some subset of people qualified for Medicaid, and that's how they were going to get coverage, and then others were going to go into the exchanges because they had slightly higher incomes. Because of the decision of the Roberts Court that we couldn't incentivize states to expand Medicaid the way we had originally intended, you've got a lot of really big states. You've got tens of millions of people who aren't able to get their Medicaid coverage, and so there's this gap. And that's probably the biggest challenge for us. The good news is that in dribs and drabs, much as was true with the original Medicaid program, you're starting to see Republican governors and Republican state legislatures realize that, yeah, we're cutting off our nose to spite our face, right? We got an ideological objection to us helping our own constituencies and our own healthcare systems, and to their credit, you got folks like John Kasich in Ohio and Snyder in Michigan, and now most recently a governor up in Alaska and others who are saying, you know what, this is the right thing to do. Let's go ahead and expand it. So until that kind of settles, I don't think we'll fully know where there's still gaps in coverage, what more we still need to do. But I think that so far at least, the performance of the plans itself, not the website in the first 3 months, but the performance of the actual plans, has at least met and perhaps exceeded a lot of people's expectations. The website, by the way, works great now.
I'm going to tag out and let Matt in, but thank you very much for taking the time, sir.
Really enjoyed it.